Good afternoon. JCPA's highest honor is the Albert D. Chernin Award. This annual award remembers Al, who was a soft-spoken, passionate, deeply committed, and inspirational Jewish American. The award honors one whose work exemplifies the social justice imperatives of Judaism, Jewish history, and the freedoms enshrined in the Bill of Rights. To present this year's award, we are so pleased to welcome Dahlia Litwick, one of the country's most respected chroniclers of the Supreme Court. An award-winning journalist, Dahlia is a senior editor at Slate, where she writes about the courts and the law and hosts the podcast Amicus. She helps make complex cases and legal principles accessible to her readers, while never failing to remind us why the Constitution and the law deeply matter to us all. Dahlia has followed, interviewed, and written about our honoree, Justice Stephen Breyer, over the last 20 years. It is a pleasure to have her with us today to present this recognition to Justice Breyer. Please join me for this very special program and welcome Dahlia to present the 2022 Albert D. Chernin Award. Dahlia.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you to JCPA. The first time I met Justice Breyer was probably about 2 decades ago when he thanked me for doing the kind of journalism that just gently mocked some of the stuffiness of the Supreme Court proceedings. He came up to me and said, "I see what you're doing there, and it's very important." And to a young journalist, it changed my world. A few years later, he and I were seated next to each other at a luncheon, and I thanked Justice Breyer for citing one of my articles in the magisterial dissent he wrote in the 2015 case of Glossop versus Gross. That was a challenge to the machinery of capital punishment as it exists in the United States. He waited a beat after I thanked him and said, "Well, it would have been better if it were a majority opinion." Throughout his long career in government and on the bench, Justice Breyer has been dedicated not only to the law and the rule of law, but to the processes and the levers and the architecture of the law, to developing what he likes to call workable systems, and to creating the scaffolding of a system of constitutional democracy in which all of us benefit by working to benefit everyone. It's hardly surprising that these core values of tikkun olam, what Justice Breyer likes to call tzedek, the marriage of righteousness and compassion to the law itself, have shaped his entire public life. Whether it was his passionate majority opinion in Whole Women's Health, the 2016 decision ensuring reproductive freedom for Texas women, or his landmark dissent in Glossop, pointing out that the way we administer the death penalty is inherently racist, inherently unjust and immoral, or his historic dissent in Parents Involved, a school desegregation case. Whenever Justice Breyer writes, it is never in service or winning or losing tribal spats. It is never in the interest of personal fame or getting tweetable pot shots in or quotable memes. His legal project is forever in service of perfecting a system, the system of how we vote, how we get healthcare, how children are educated, how we regulate guns in a nation that is drowning in them. And in perfecting these systems, Justice Breyer fights to ensure that everyone can benefit regardless of race, religion, income, class, or color. And in that sense, I think that Justice Breyer's is the quintessentially Jewish view of both tzedek and of tikkun. It is the dogged, tireless daily work of justice and repair, disaggregated from big egos and fame. It is the story of dialectic, of curiosity, of moral capaciousness, and a search for a knowable truth. The rabbis teach that it is better to be committed to the search for truth than to know the truth. And Justice Breyer has participated in that search, dedicated to collegiality, to presumptions of good faith, to the ability to transcend personal ideology and preference, because only through such a search for truth can competing ideas really be tested. For people like me who like to tweak Justice Breyer sometimes for his absent-minded professorness or his hyper-focus on technical detail or his landmark famous 5-part hypothetical questions that sometimes leave oral advocates in a complete puddle at oral arguments, I have learned to say over the years that this is exactly what justice looks like. This is exactly what tzedek looks like, in all its nuance, technicality, and in all its humility. It is also most emphatically what I think true Torah looks like: competing ideas, incremental understanding, deep compassion and humility, not just for human frailty, but for the text itself. Justice Breyer's life work is testament to that effort, as are the small army of his former law clerks who continue the work in the academy, in government, in the practice of law, and on the bench. It is one of the great honors of my lifetime to have known and admired Justice Stephen Breyer, who models the production of light without heat every single day on and off the job. His work to protect free speech, religious liberty, the rights and dignity of LGBTQ Americans, the right to vote, and the right of teenagers to talk annoyingly in school. This is the stuff of constitutional legend. And it is also, I think, part of the slipstream of so many great Jewish thinkers and leaders that come before. It is my honor to present this year's Albert D. Chernin Award to an American Jew whose life work exemplifies social justice, imperatives of Judaism and of democracy, to Justice Stephen G. Breyer.
Tonight, I'd like to honor someone who dedicated his life to serve this country. Justice Breyer, an Army veteran, constitutional scholar, retiring Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Justice Breyer, thank you for your service. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Justice Breyer, who was born in San Francisco a little while ago, attended Stanford, Oxford, and Harvard Law School. He married Joanna Breyer, had 3 wonderful children. He was appointed by President Clinton to the United States Supreme Court in the early 90s.
Judge Stephen Breyer.
I have been given quite a few labels, but I hope no one would mind if I'm particularly proud of one label, that of judge. And so if I am confirmed to the Supreme Court of the United States, I will devote myself to the best of my ability to ensuring that both the letter and the spirit of our laws continue to serve the people of this country.
I had the privilege of clerking for Justice Breyer in 1996, and also the privilege of arguing 45 cases at the United States Supreme Court before him. And I've never seen a more humble or more graceful public servant than Justice Stephen Breyer.
To be a Breyer clerk means that you were able to work with a justice who is brilliant, who is fair, who looks at all angles of a legal problem and always has the most incisive insights. To watch his mind work, to see how he takes into consideration the views of the parties, the practical effects of the opinion, the weight of the precedents. There's really no better education in the law that any of us could imagine.
When his colleagues attacked him, and some of them did so vigorously in written opinions, in personal ways, I and my co-clerks would say, Justice, you've got to hit back. But every time we'd say, that's not how we do business. That's not what we do at the Supreme Court. And he just let all the insults roll off him, never said one back, never descended to that sandbox. And I think of that all the time as I think about the degradation of public discourse. And I think Justice Breyer points the way towards a solution.
I sit there on the bench, and after we hear lots of cases, and after a while, the impression you get is, as you well know, this is a complicated country. There are more than 330 million people. And my mother used to say it's every race, it's every religion, and she would emphasize this, and it's every point of view possible. And it's a kind of miracle when you sit there and see all those people in front of you, people that are so different in what they think, and yet they've decided to help solve their major differences under law.
I think his legacy at the court will be known for doing what he said he'd do at his confirmation hearing, which is help make the American government work better for the people.
This is a justice that has seen difficult, awful things that come before the Supreme Court to decide. And there were some times that were really challenging. And through everything, no matter what was thrown before him, no matter what the challenges were, no matter how significant, I never saw him, and I don't think anybody ever saw him lose his fundamental optimism about our judicial system, about our institutions generally and their strength and their importance in our society, and about all of his colleagues on the bench. This is a person who every day brought to work an attitude that he could find consensus with the other 8 justices so that he could be part of an institution that he just believes so deeply in.
Justice Breyer not only gave me the greatest job that any young lawyer could ever hope to have, but he also exemplified every day in every way that a Supreme Court justice can perform at the highest level of skill and integrity while also being guided by civility, grace, pragmatism, and generosity of spirit. Justice Breyer, the members of the Senate will decide if I fill your seat, but please know that I could never fill your shoes.
Could you please unmute, Judge? Could you please unmute?
Justice Breyer, you're muted.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I'm not very technical, but I'd say, my goodness, I'm very moved by this. This is the physical embodiment of the award. But thank you so much, Susan. And Dahlia, that was lovely. Thank you so much. And you only left out your sense of humor because your sense of humor, and it really helps. And it helps the court, and it helps explain things to people, and it gets them interested. And that's important. That's important. And my law clerks, my goodness, my law clerks are my extended family. I mean, one of the great joys of this job is having that extended family of law clerks. It's great. And to be recognized by this group that's recognized so many Jews who are in trouble, so many human beings who are in trouble, trying to create a better life for people, whether they're from Russia, as I think that Chernin eventually originally was, or whether they're from some other country, or whether they're Jewish or whether they're not, they're helped. And there we are. And I always think being a Jew, yes, what does that mean? That you're more interested in the practicalities of this life? I don't know. But it might. It might. And does it mean that you see in individual cases underneath, the words of the prophet, let justice roll on like a river? Well, does it sort of bring that home? No, maybe. Maybe. I'll let others decide that, but it might. And it's true, you have case after case after case after case. And they mean a great deal to the people who will be affected by those decisions. And that means for a judge who decides it, or helps decide it, or dissents, you have to give your best. And that's one of the privileges of this job, because it requires you to give your best the whole time. And to see the job, to see the need for justice, and to see the need for a practical solution that will, in fact, enable people to live in this country continuously with respect for and under a rule of law. Myself, as you have done, associating me with that, I think is a privilege, it's an honor, and I'm very, very grateful. So thank you all. I have 3 or 4 hour long lectures if you'd like. No, good. Where are we? You're on.
Justice Breyer, I'm being asked to just say on behalf of JCPA, thank you for joining. Thank you for your kind words. Really, thank you for, as I said, the army of good people you've put in the world.
Well, it's me that I thank you because it's, you said I am moved by this very much, more than you can know. And, I appreciate very much what you and the others and the inscription here and what everyone has said. Much personally appreciated, and also just generally, thank you.
Thank you so much to Justice Breyer. Those remarks were touching, and it was a real privilege to be able to share this virtual screen with you today. We're very grateful to you for participating and for accepting the Chernin Award from JCPA. And thank you to Dahlia as well for that wonderful introduction and the beautiful video, which I did like, also had Justice Breyer in a Red Sox hat, which is always very much appreciated. So we're going to take our next speakers are coming on in a few minutes. So we're going to take some time to actually reflect at this point on what freedom means to all of us. And I'd like to see if Susan can come back on with me, if we can possibly get the tech going. One of the, as you know, the theme for our conference is, what does freedom mean to you? And I'm going to share what freedom means to me. And it's actually an honor that Justice Breyer is on here for that reason, because freedom to me as a gay person means that I am allowed to live my life the way I want to live my life. I don't need to be afraid and hide my identity in any way. I can love who I want to love. I can talk openly about what it means to be a gay person and how being a gay person relates to my identity as a Jew. I think it's critical, as someone who grew up really in the 80s and 90s, that we continue to move forward as a society. And it hurts to see society in a lot of ways seeming to move backwards at this point. I know that growing up and being afraid to talk about my sexual orientation was something that was really difficult and really painful for me. And so being free means that I am free to be who I am. I'm gonna turn it over to Susan in a second. And while Susan is speaking, we invite you to put into the chat what being free means to you. What does it mean to you to be free? Susan?
Thanks so much, Lee. Freedom for me actually goes to the heart of community relations, because freedom for me means the ability to join and be part of and take a leadership role in the various communities that I have been a part of throughout my life. I started as a Canadian. I came to school in the United States. I have lived in Portland, Oregon. I've lived in Washington, DC, and I've participated in the Jewish community nationally. And in each of those circumstances, I've been able to bring together communities of ethnic dialogue, interethnic dialogue, interreligious dialogue, and to really try to build that sense of justice and freedom that we talk about so often at JCPA within those various contexts. I'm turning it back to you, Lee, now, so that we can go to the chat and pick a couple of comments from the chat.
Okay, at this point, I am looking at the chat, and the freedom, the silence from the crowd is deafening. So I'm encouraging people to write in. Oh, we have, okay. So we have some folks writing in. Here we go. So from Neal Borovitz, freedom is not just a license to do whatever I want. Rather, that means that along with my rights, I have responsibility for others. Thank you, Neal.
And from Diane Fisher, being free means having mutual respect for our diverse communities and being able to stand together in solidarity. So well put, Diane. Thank you.
It's okay. They can be, you can give us some fun, you can give us some fun ones. They don't all have to be serious, right? Freedom can be freedom to go get an ice cream at 10 o'clock in the morning. That we'll take that. From Leslie Anderson, being free means to me the ability to think deeply and to share those thoughts without threats of harm.
That's such an appropriate comment at this point in time. And Stephen Stone, to be a Jew in my public life and not have anxiety about public involvement because of it.
From David Bohm, freedom to me means being able to speak out on the issues of importance to the Jewish and general communities, and the ability to raise my family in accordance with Jewish values.
From Sharon, freedom to me means the freedom to not just worship the way I'm sorry, it's moving, the worship the way though I want to, excuse me, to choose the way I want to, dress the way I choose, leave my corporate job and pursue a career as an actress. I was just getting to the ice cream choice. Lee, mint chocolate chip if you're buying.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sharon. From Julia, we have not fun, but freedom is autonomy to live a life based on my own choices and beliefs, so long as it does not fringe on the freedom of others.
And from our own Tammy Gilden, freedom to me means speaking truth to power without fear of retribution.
From Elena, freedom for me is understanding my place in the world as the grandchild of Holocaust survivors and fighting for freedom for all because of that legacy.
And from April, freedom for all people everywhere, not living in fear for my children and future great-grandchildren to live fully in all of their identities, including Jewish. At this point, I think it's very important for us to remember those who are in Ukraine who do not have that freedom.
Thank you, Susan. From Stacy, freedom to me means freedom from the idolatry of conspiracy theories and insurrectionism. Just as the Israelites had to receive the Torah to live free in a promised land, our fate remains tied to strong democratic institutions, pluralism, and ethical justice.
And from Furhani, for me, a person from Russia, being free is having the opportunity to express my thoughts and to have the right to speak up about the problems I see around without fear. Kol hakavod to you, honey.
From Kimberlyn, and I just lost Kimberlyn's quote. Here we go. From Kimberlyn, freedom to me as a Southern Black woman in Georgia is spending my day with abolitionists nationwide at the JCPA conference. I am grateful. Thank you, Kimberlyn.
And from Yuval Bernstein, freedom to me is the ability to stand up and yell about what is on your mind and fight for the way of life that you choose.
Okay, so we have from Eden. Freedom means being able to go to synagogue without fear, to dress in my traditional garb, to vote, to express my respectful opinions without being afraid of being canceled, to exist in many spaces without having to be a chameleon. Oh, beautifully stated, Eden. Thank you.
And I have the pleasure of introducing to you my daughter's comment. Karen Abravanel, as Jews, we are always commanded to remember again and again that we were once slaves. And at Passover, we are told to live the Exodus as if it is happening now. Our freedom is precarious and it is precious and it is recent. It is a humbling reminder that we must help others who still await liberation. Thank you, sweetheart.
Oh, so what a perfect note to end on. Susan, thank you. And thank you to everyone for contributing your thoughts on freedom. This is a fun interactive segment. And we are now going to take a short break before our next segment, and we'll welcome you back.
We have all our speakers on, so we're going to continue right now.
Okay, we're back. Hey, everyone. So, turning to a different topic, as the horrific images of barbarism in Ukraine shock the conscience of the world, we are grateful to be joined by Colonel Alexander Vindman, a native of what is now Ukraine. To guide our conversation, we have invited Bianna Gologdryga, a senior global affairs analyst at CNN. Bianna, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Can you see me? Can you hear me? I'm still new to this whole technology thing some 30 years later, so bear with us. Hi, Alex. How are you?
There we go. I'm great. As always, great to see you, and looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I am really looking forward to talking to you. Obviously, you're one of the most important voices, and I'm glad you've been so vocal throughout the build up to this war, and obviously now 7 weeks in. I'm just curious if you can sort of lay the scene, the groundworks for us in terms of what the picture looks like now, this new stage the Russians are taking, given that their initial plan in going after Kyiv turned out to be a disaster for them. They have a new general on the ground there known as the Butcher of Syria. That gives you a sense of his past and the direction they're taking the war forward. Give us a sense of what's going on and the focus now on the eastern part of Ukraine.
Sure. Well, I'm glad you are happy to hear my voice, because I think plenty of people are not at this point. I've become increasingly critical of this administration, openly so. Not President Biden per se. I think he's actually said a lot of the right things. Certainly, his speech in Poland was notable. More than that, it's kind of was pivotal, and I think it's clear where he wants to go. But there's those deep staters in government. I'm joking a little bit when I say that, but government's a big bureaucracy, and there are different kind of power centers, and there is a lot of resistance to rendering the kind of support that even President Biden indicated he's prepared to go to. So I've been critical of the NSC, and I've been increasingly critical of defense for not doing enough. We are in a position where Ukraine has helped preserve the Western liberal order, U.S. prosperity, in spite of the missteps of this administration and the failure to do enough early on. We were on the cusp of something new and something that we have not seen in a long time. A U.S. and democracy under peril from around the world, authoritarianism emboldened to attack democracy's interests around the world. And it's because of the fierce defense of the Ukrainian population, the indomitable spirit, the unwillingness to sacrifice freedoms, to sacrifice lives ahead of sacrificing freedoms, that has actually preserved a something that we could recognize, a democratic world order. And they've provided space for us to be able to help them resist Russia, the second most powerful military in the world, resist authoritarianism, and we're not doing enough. In the first phase of this war, there was a lot of defeatism about the fact that the Ukrainians were not going to be able to survive this. It would be a quick operation for Russia. It wasn't just the US, frankly. The Russians thought the same way. The Russians thought that they would be able to roll over Ukraine. It was going to be easy, low cost, both on the battlefields in Ukraine and then with regards to the reaction from the democratic world. On all those counts, they were wrong. They thought that they would be able to conduct a lightning operation, encircle Kiev, remove the democratic elected regime, and replace it with a puppet government. The Ukrainians blocked those aspirations. I think they blocked them permanently, frankly. Russia can no longer threaten the entirety and the existence of the state of Ukraine, but it can do some significant damage. It can conduct a protracted war that keeps the future of Ukraine very precarious. And for many weeks, The Ukrainians have largely done this on their own. They have gotten some tactical equipment, these javelins from the US, these Stingers from the US, the analogous systems from Europe have been coming in, but it's mainly the fighting prowess of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military that has preserved the battlefield with victories for Ukraine. We're now facing a different kind of campaign. This phase of the war is much more focused. In a lot of ways, it's a lot more dangerous. I was as anxious as anybody else in the first several days because I also, overestimated Russia and underestimated Ukraine. But in reality, in hindsight, 2020, Ukraine and Kiev were never really under threat. Russia just didn't have the fighting prowess. They didn't have the material to do that. This is a phase of the operation where the Russians actually can achieve some effects, much more focused. Russia still has the advantages with air power, with artillery. Russia has the advantages with advanced kind of ground fighting capabilities, tanks, armored vehicles. And I think this is a phase of the war where Russia can achieve some successes, and it's trying to press to do those before the victory parades on May 9th. And if it does that, it's a recipe for protracted war. If Ukraine wins decisively here, this next battle, then Russia's a spent force. It would take it months to rebuild, to conduct future combat operations. But it needs to win. Ukraine needs to win. Russia needs to be defeated decisively. If not, this is a recipe for protracted war, and we could find ourselves in a situation where Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Kiev, and Odessa are under threat.
I'm glad you brought up the May 9th on the calendar. And for those that are, watching here, that's a significant date for Russians. That is the Victory Day, highlighted by a massive parade annually through Moscow. And this is something that Vladimir Putin has said will in fact happen again this year and take place. And I think you're right to allude to the fact that he's got to have something to show for it, right? And just saying that I have Donetsk and Luhansk, and here we can claim victory over that is not something that's going to be a big enough prize, I would imagine, for him or for the Russian people, given the price they've paid and the thousands of troops they've lost. I wonder, given that, and given that we're talking about less than a month's time now, is a prize? Is this what Mariupol is all about right now? What could be that big capture that Vladimir Putin can showcase in the next 3 weeks? And what can the Ukrainians do to make sure that doesn't happen?
Sure. So this is, I think at this point, this is a coin flip to a certain extent, in terms of odds of who wins. Ukraine has the massive advantages of morale and fighting prowess. Russia has the massive advantages of military capabilities, technology, air power, these types of things. So it's too close. I think, frankly, Ukraine could probably still pull this out, to tell you the truth. Right, the latest estimates are that there are about 55 battalion tactical groups that are operating from Kharkiv or Luhansk all the way down to Mykolaiv. That's about 800 kilometers of frontage along the battle space. And the estimates are that each one of those battalions could cover about 1,000 meters. So it has a fraction of the force it needs to, but it potentially does have sufficient force to encircle Ukrainian formations and defeat Ukrainian formations. That's the danger if the Ukrainians get pinned down. I think Mariupol, the rest of the Luhansk and Donetsk regions offer a teaser of sorts that this war is far from done. That Vladimir Putin can achieve his military objectives, can subordinate Ukraine. If he does this, all he really needs to do is deliver some victories, Mariupol and those two regions being part of it. And then that buys time to continue to press this broader war against Ukraine. So it's not enough. Yeah, it's not enough. I mean, this is a guy that likes to ride on horseback shirtless, or, tranquilize Siberian tigers and make a show of it. So he's looking for something that he could claim, but this is only kind of something that keeps him satisfied for only a short period of time. He needs to deliver Ukraine as a whole.
Yeah, tranquilizes tigers only to have the tiger killed because they use 3 tranquilizers.
Yes.
For his photo op. kissing a tiger. So on that note, I'm just curious to get your reaction to what, I worry that we become so used to seeing Volodymyr Zelensky appealing to nations around the world for more military aid, and that sort of at some point falling on deaf ears, given the surprising way they've combat Russians, right, and overpowered them. It seems to diminish the urgency at times of the need for those weaponry, yesterday, not tomorrow. And over the weekend, in an interview with 60 Minutes, he alluded at that, and he said, yes, I'm very thankful for what the U.S. is doing. I have no doubt that the Ukrainians can win, but he is doubtful that he'll be getting everything he needs from the Biden administration. What exactly is it that his country needs in terms of weapons from the U.S. administration, and why aren't they getting it?
I would describe it to a certain extent as national security negligence to not weigh in and provide the kind of support Ukraine needs right now. You could see a situation where defeat is snatched from the jaws of victory because Russia continues to ratchet up pressure. It has a population of 140 million, vast depots of equipment. And over the long slog of a war and just through battles of attrition, Russia could still win because we decided that we could sit on the sidelines, and we could. It's okay to have Ukraine win a little, Russia not lose too much, because if Russia loses too much, it's destabilizing. This is legitimately how some of the folks in the government are thinking. That it's too destabilizing if Ukraine wins by too much.
Really?
And that, yes, it is. The kinds of things that they need are the kinds of things that they've lost over the course of the 6 weeks of this campaign. Those are artillery systems. They slowly started to lose artillery systems. Russia has a massive, overwhelming superiority in artillery. These are those cannons that are so important to break up Russian columns of supply vehicles and attack armored and stuff like that. They need the replenishment of those types of things. They've lost air defense capabilities to prevent Russia from having freedom of the skies. They need those replaced. They need strike capabilities, something that they actually haven't had from the beginning, and that I've been talking about, which is unmanned combat aerial vehicles. There are systems available. I've talked to the manufacturers. There are systems available. And frankly, there probably are even donor dollars that would be for folks that are willing to buy those, not at government expense. But the government will not loosen the reins on tech transfer, these ITAR regulations, and because they think it's too provocative. So I think we have a situation in which Ukraine very well may not get everything it needs. It may not even get what it requires to continue to sustain itself for the next 4 to 6 weeks. And the Ukrainians are going to fight the Russians with whatever they have available. And they're just going to take punishing casualties. They're not going to give up. So it's pretty disappointing that this administration goes to worst case scenarios without considering probabilities. And again, I'm not speculating here. This is informed by numerous conversations with numerous people about how things are unfolding, and it's basically a worst case scenario about how us providing some weapons gets us on an escalatory spiral that causes us the U.S. to have to war against Russia directly. Highly unlikely, or that somehow even more far-fetched that this idea that there's a nuclear war at the end of this. That is very, very far-fetched in the short term. I think in the long term, that's where things get dicey, and it's hard to predict how things unfold, because Russia, in its struggle to achieve military aims, does press to conduct chemical weapons attacks, and that puts a huge amount of pressure on the U.S. to respond. So I think. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I go back to that point that you made about people inside the administration alluding to you that there's only a certain threshold that Ukraine can, quote unquote, win in this war, and that a decisive victory is not in U.S. Is it U.S. national security interest? I mean, in terms of destabilizing, is it that they are worried about what happens if Russia is overwhelmed completely and maybe they turn to nuclear weapons? I mean, I'm just trying to understand the rationale behind that.
So I think in the early days of this war, it was a calculation that Ukraine can't win. Ukraine's going to lose no matter what. Why should we do anything besides provide them with minimal equipment in those early days? Why should we take any of the risk? Now it's a different, it's kind of the same picture, but a different degree. Ukraine can't win too much. Now that we pivoted to the fact that recognizing that Ukraine could win, but Ukraine can't win too much because that somehow destabilizes Russia and Russia becomes more erratic. Russia decides to wage chemical or nuclear war. Or frankly, I think that's still a far-fetched notion. And I think the policymakers are sophisticated enough to maybe even parse some of this stuff. Or Russia fractures. The regime crumbles and we don't know who comes next. You know, I'm working on my doctorate at Johns Hopkins and I'm researching basically the U.S. foreign policy towards Russia and Ukraine since 1991. And in those early days of this, you know, the Soviet collapse and this formation of newly independent states, there was a enormous amount of focus on preserving the center, preserving Kremlin power over the republics, because we were afraid of Balkanization, the wars in Yugoslavia unfolding in the republics. They did on smaller scales. Russia, you know, interfered and kind of established frozen conflicts in about 6 different regions, or that there was a loose nuke scenario, and who handles those nuclear weapons. So these are the kinds of, like, you know, worst case scenario fears. The problem is that we're not the ones that are going to decide this. It's frankly, in a lot of cases, the damage has already been done. Russia has suffered 20,000 deaths and 60,000 casualties overall. Russia is going to stay isolated. It's going to be a pariah state as long as Putin's in power. And when the population eventually learns about this, it's not going to be, you know, U.S. actions or something like that trigger Russian collapse. It'll be internal pressures based on the fact that Putin failed to deliver. He failed to deliver on prosperity. He failed to deliver on stability. He failed to deliver on security. Those are the kind of the promises that he made to the population in exchange for less freedoms. So we also have this deep hubris about U.S. power and how much control we have over facts on the ground. The best we can do is get off the sidelines and provide Ukraine with some additional military material to win this fight. That's the role here. We don't play a central role in how things are going to unfold in either Ukraine or Russia.
Yeah. I was, caught my attention to hear Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, last week say that this war should be measured not in weeks or months, but years. Given that, I'm curious to get your thoughts on whether Vladimir Putin views that as an advantage for him, in that while in the interim, we have seen a reunified, rejuvenated NATO and the alliance has come together. Do you think that he could be calculating on the longer this continues, the more economic strain that will befall upon largely, Europe, even more so than the United States, more democratic elections that could lead to potentially more liberal leaders like Orban, right? And in Serbia recently had an election. We saw what happened over the weekend and how well Marine Le Pen did in France. Could that be an instrument for Vladimir Putin to continue pursuing this war, knowing that perhaps it could lead to fissures down the road?
I think that's exactly right. He made some tragic miscalculations, but he has a pretty good pulse on Europe and how statesmen sitting opposite from him respond, and he understands that there are, in fact, deep divisions that he could exploit. I think we should separate out, Viktor Orban and Vučić in Serbia from what's happening with regards to France. Those are incumbents. Those are in undemocratic regimes with kind of all the scales heavily tipped in their favor. In France, that's not the case. The margin in 2017 between Macron and Le Pen was actually tighter. It was like 24 to 21%. And then in the second round, it was a huge gap. It was like 30% margin. I think it's likely to play out in much the same way here in the runoff election. So yes, it looks pretty scary right now, but it was 27 to 21% or 23%. So slightly bigger margin than it was in 2017 for the last time these elections were run. but this is right in front of our face, and we don't think the margin should be even this close, obviously. So it worries us. I have not seen the kinds of indications that Marie Le Pen is likely to do better in the runoff than she does in the past. You know, she's going to probably draw about a third of the population like she did last time. But I think Putin is calculating that in the long run, he does have the advantages. He potentially has them on the battlefields in Ukraine, because his country is 140 million people, and Ukraine is 40 million people now with all the refugee flows. Vastly different budgets. Russia is suffering it looks like it's going to suffer about 11% GDP drop, while Ukraine is going to suffer a 45% GDP drop. So, let's be kind and say $300 billion for Ukraine. It's not that high. It's probably closer to about 270. Mm-hmm. It's now halved. Whereas Russia is going to suffer 11% on $1.6 or $1.8 trillion. So it has the ability to sustain this war for quite some time. It has all these depots, almost as far as the eye can see with equipment. So I think in a protracted war, that's true. But Chairman Milley is basically stating the obvious. I mean, there is no ground break. This war has been going on for 8 years, and up until about 6 weeks ago, the prognosis from General Milley and the military was that Ukraine was going to fall in 96 hours. So that's great that he's catching up to the fact that this has now been a protracted war. Mm-hmm. But you could kind of see my frustration with folks at this point. I think the Department of Defense has been 2, 3, 4 weeks behind on their assessment of where Ukraine is and where Russia is. Russia, in terms of losses, they're still saying, 15% losses or something like that. And the Russians have suffered closer to 30% losses in terms of their combat power. All the Ukrainians need is, win the next 4 to 6 weeks. And they really set back the Russian military for months. It could still be a protracted war, but it's going to take Russia months to rebuild. Meanwhile, they have to deal with all the internal pressures. So to me, it's deeply frustrating to kind of watch this plodding, slow progress as our massive government kind of comes around to reality and still is highly reactive instead of proactive, looking around the corner. And I'm sure you hear that frustration coming out, but I'll tell you, right before this, I was talking to somebody on the ground in Poland, and the atrocities the Russians are committing there. I'm waiting for verification of this latest round, and it doesn't surprise me. I'll give the disclaimer that this is yet to be verified, but they're sickening. 40 kids, now orphans, raped in front of their parents murdered and raped again. And then for some reason, on top of all that barbarism, the Russians pulled out their teeth. Human beings don't behave like this. So it's really, really, really hard to watch this unfold, and the U.S. kind of sitting on the sidelines and not doing enough when the costs are really not that high, if you think through the consequences, how the Russians are likely to react. But that's where we are.
At some point you just run out of words, right, to sort of amplify how we as human beings respond to massacres like this, to scenes like this. Obviously, we know war is ugly, and there's always death and brutality involved, but to reiterate that this is happening in 2022, right? And with the use of technology and sources like you to have access to on the ground documentation about what's happening, it's unimaginable. And yet every day we're hearing more and more about this. I'm just curious, because I know personally and anecdotally, I've been shocked, and at this point it's hard to shock me, with the response in Russia. Yes, there is state-run media now controlling all of the media in the country. There's no more independent media. This is why propaganda is so effective. But I keep going back to statements that Volodymyr Zelensky has made directed towards the Russian people, and saying, who raised you? How, as mothers, could you not be concerned about your sons dying here? And B, his response was, I hate these troops. I hate that they're here and invaded my country. But when I see the brutality, it makes me even feel terrible. And I'm curious to get your response to how Russians have not only distanced themselves from, it's not that they've just even distanced themselves from this war, they seem to have embraced it, at least short term, and rallying around the flag in Russia.
Yep. Well, there's a frenzied war fever sweeping across Russia that is definitely kind of rallied around war, and a barbarous kind of war. I mean, I've been on following, as much as I can, everything that's going on, and catching probably the bulk of the meaningful materials coming through. And there was something actually within the past 4 weeks that laid out a template. And if you didn't have the dates, or you replaced, if you removed Russia and Ukraine, this would have sounded like a blueprint from Nazi Germany about how to eradicate the Ukrainian population, imprison tens of millions of Ukrainians, and basically kind of reformat Ukraine to be, I guess, I don't know, enslaved really to the to Russia. And I think there's frankly a big buy-in into this idea. I think a lot of that is still misplaced ideas of the fact that success is right around the corner. I think the population is not getting the information about how catastrophic this war has been thus far. The impact of sanctions is likely to unfold in weeks and months still, and not in a way that's going to really shift the thinking of the population for a while. And the resistance of the Germans, at times they make the right noises, but too often it's one step forward, two steps back with regards to resisting sanctioning oil or providing weapons to Ukraine. I think it seems to me that right now there's not been enough pain inflicted on Russia and the Russian population and the Russian armed forces to end this catastrophe. And it really does. I'm watching a slow moving train wreck where we really are headed towards a protracted war that we had every means to avert. We probably had means to avert it before it started. Mm-hmm. And I was jumping up and down, calling for sanctions beforehand, not in response to Russia, but beforehand, pushing troops to secure NATO beforehand, arming Ukraine beforehand. And now we're still having a deep resistance to getting Ukraine what it needs to, when in fact, I think most people intellectually understand, these leaders are not unsophisticated. They understand that Ukraine is really preserving the world order, the kind of world order that we want to live in. But we're okay with Ukraine doing that, and again, winning just enough. That's the mentality. And it's hard for me to rationalize. I mean, I'm a policymaker myself, but it's hard for me to understand, what's right in front of us and what doesn't seem to resonate with these leaders.
In the last few moments we have here, I'm just curious because, as you know, and anyone who studies Russian history, Russians can withstand a lot of pain and suffering. And I just wonder, in terms of what will bring this to an end, clearly it's not massive troop loss, right? Vladimir Putin has showed he has disregard for human life and suffering. And perhaps we thought maybe it would be pressure internally from the Russian people, but was he right to assume that, as he's been saying for years now, these sanctions are not in response to, anything wrong that Russia is doing? This is what he's telling the Russian people. He's telling them that this is a bigger conspiracy from the West to keep Russia at bay and not become the great empire that and world power that it deserves to be. And it appears to be working for me, and working for him, and that has me worried about how far this can go if he continues to get support, even somewhat muted, from Russians.
So I think that's right. The Russians have the fortitude to survive a lot, to take a lot of abuse, but that's also when they're attacked and when there's a just war. This is an unjust war. This is an unprovoked war. This is, I think I'd say this is closer to Afghanistan, except on a much, much grander scale. And there was not a huge amount of stomach for that war. And I think civil society eventually broke through. I think that's what's going to slowly unfold in Ukraine and Russia, based on the casualties Russia's suffering, based on the fact that these sanctions hopefully increase and that even the 11% start to bite. I think, to me, the most important thing we could do is help Ukraine decide this on the battlefield. That's where this ends. When Russia doesn't have a military to continue its combat operations, that's where this war ends. That's when Russia starts to sue for peace. I don't think that's a recipe for escalation, at least not in the short term. In the long term, it could be, but in the short term, his generals tell him, we do not have the force to do that. You could attempt to feed in soldiers piecemeal, like frankly they're going to be doing over the next 4 to 6 weeks, but they're not going to achieve any effects. It's just going to be a grinding war, and we could help Ukraine prevent this from turning into protracted war, and help this war that is already in a lot of ways a global war, a war, but much of it Cold War between democracy and authoritarianism, win the battle for democracy before this turns into a hot war. That's where we could help. We could help win this battle for democracy.
Yeah, it is interesting that President Biden ran and campaigned on, and early on in his administration framed it that same way too. It's a bit different when you're using rhetoric as opposed to reality. And he put it in the context of the US versus China mainly. And yet here we are seeing this play out with Russia. Let me end by asking you, just on a personal note, for those that are not familiar with your background, you and your family came as political refugees from the former Soviet Union, then Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And I had a similar story. I came from, with my parents, I think we were just a year or two apart, from Moldova. What has this been like as a refugee to this country, as somebody who, came here because of your heritage and being Jewish and persecuted there, to now not only be addressing this, obviously because this is your profession, but also just personally, your relationship to Ukraine now, your ties, obviously you're an American, but you're a Ukrainian American. What has this experience been like for you?
It's interesting. You may very well agree with me, but for a long time, I resisted my Ukrainian heritage based on a misplaced notion of the atrocities pogroms committed against the Jewish population. I also recognized as a professional that a lot of those notions were misplaced and simplified, that it wasn't just the Ukrainians, it was the Russians that were as bad, as evil, as heinous. We were on the cusp of Russia committing genocide, Soviet Union committed genocide. There was the whole, the pretext of the doctor's plot and the attempted assassination of Stalin that we narrowly averted because he died. So I think it's a simplistic notion. I now take a deep sense of pride in the fact that I'm of Ukrainian heritage. The Ukrainian people are heroic in their perseverance, their desire for freedom, their fortitude. On a lighter note, I could take pride in being a Jewish Ukrainian like Vladimir Zelensky. We're hot commodity at the moment. But I think, I just do take a huge amount of pride, and my resistance to always putting, I still put the US first, but I always kind of trying to figure out what's the best way to frame myself. I came here when I was a toddler, don't really know anything other than America. And I think, American national security is at the forefront of my mind, but I'm happy to identify myself as a, American Ukrainian or Ukrainian American, although it still doesn't feel right to put Ukrainian before the American part. But I think I do have a pride in that, those people.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I was born in Moldova, and for years, I would just tell people I was Russian or from Soviet Union for no other reason that people didn't know what Moldova was. And having seen now, I just went back last weekend for the first time in 35 years and obviously I'm an American, and it's not as if I felt like I was quote unquote home back in Moldova, but to have gone full circle, leaving that country as a political refugee and then coming back to cover how that country has embraced so many of those, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of refugees that have come through Moldova now from Ukraine. It really, I think your perspective, my perspective, those of other immigrants, reminded of how lucky we are to be Americans, and also why it's so important to amplify the need for us to constantly stay on the story and remind people this is a fight for democracy. We saw a totalitarian regime just invade a sovereign nation, and we're in the midst of this again in 2022. It's unbelievable, but it's happening. So I'm so thankful for your expertise and you constantly speaking your mind and helping us navigate through this very dark and painful period. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman.
That's a formality. We know that we're well past that now, Bianna.
I know. It still sounds good.
I know. It's always a pleasure, and looking forward to seeing you in the near future.
Yes.
Wow, that was extraordinary. Thank you to Alex and Bianna for that eye-opening conversation. I think we can all agree we could use a break right now. So we're going to take a break from now until 3:15 p.m. Eastern, at which time we'll resume with some more workshops. Once again, we have an outstanding series of workshop choices for you, featuring timely concerns with leading experts and advocates. As you make your choice, please note that all workshops will be recorded and a link to them will be sent to you following the conference. This session will automatically close before the workshops start. You will be placed back into the lobby. The workshop options will appear in the lobby. Choose which workshop you want to attend and press on the join button directly under its picture. If you have trouble accessing the workshop of your choice, please find the WhatsApp group link in the chat for technical support. Thanks, and we'll see you later.